This week on Great Chat, does anyone care about bad behavior anymore? Or are we just craving drama and entertainment? And a recurring theme, how do startups break through the noise? A quick reminder, each week we answer your questions. Don't forget to submit them at anothergreatchat.com. I'm Helen, and we're joined by Sally, Angela, and Ashley this week.
Hey everyone. It's a big week for group chats. Does anyone have any war plans they would like to announce?
How did that end? It was like, great start. Good job.
Like fire emoji, American flag emoji.
100%. It's exactly what you'd expect. And they're going to start a podcast. So
great week for Signal. Angela, what are you watching this week?
Well, continuing off of, I think we talked about this last week. I have IPOs on the brain. So we talked about Klarna last week, and then StubHub, which is a secondary marketplace for tickets, just filed its S1 this week. And there were just some interesting little tidbits that I found. So one of the aspects that's unique about StubHub is they have a dual share class, which means that the founder has a different class of shares, which gives him almost 100% voting control over the company, even though he owns only a very small percentage. And we typically see this only in tech companies like Meta. So it'll be interesting to see how the market reacts to that. But other interesting tidbits were that Taylor Swift's Era concert had a huge impact on their business. In 2023, she raised sales by 14 percentage points. So not that she increased revenue by 14%, but she added 14 percentage points to their revenue. And then also it was disclosed that the CEO gets a $200,000 stipend from the company for private school tuition and childcare on top of his $5 million salary and $62 million equity package. So just some interesting tidbits that you can find in an otherwise not super exciting document. And then the other interesting headline that just came out yesterday was that BYD, which is the Chinese auto manufacturer, surpassed Tesla in revenue. I think they reported 107 billion versus Tesla at 99.7, although they sold an equal number of EVs. So it was really the balance of hybrid cars that made it up. But it was just an interesting headline given all of the attention paid to China versus US, and especially all the domestic press that Tesla has been generating with people feeling all sorts of emotions about it.
Because I don't follow IPOs anymore. I like when Angela, you flagged the StubHub tweet. I forgot that was one of the ones to watch because everyone's like waiting for the Stripes and the Klarnas of the world. And then I was like, oh, I like forgot that StubHub was looking to go public. So that was really interesting.
Well, it's an interesting, like almost like anti-AI story. Everything around like CoreWeave and everything has been, although like I did search,
and that's where the value is.
They do mention AI a bunch in their prospectus, even though they're like a secondary ticket marketplace. But it's like the opposite end of, if you're not investing in AI, you invest in live experiences and people getting together. And so it'll be interesting to see what the market reception for like a non-tech, non-AI name is.
Well, last week we saw that big exit to Google from Wiz, and so I think also non-AI. That's pretty exciting. I think that the chatter around like what funds made out from that acquisition was really interesting. I think as emerging managers of small funds, Ashley and I were like, oh, we're following Cyberstarts, and looks like that's going to be like over a 200x on their initial investment. There was other commentary about like entry price matters and questions around like large fund sizes working, because I think it was like Insight Partners who, even with this big exit, like I think that returns a third of their fund. Their fund was $9 billion, and like they're a great fund, and it's very easy to imagine that they're going to have at least two more winners from the fund that's like this. So, I don't think it's like a foregone conclusion that big funds don't work, but that conversation was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I do think they were helped by Eric Newcomer released a bunch of fund performance data, and I haven't spent all the time with it that I would like to, but Insight actually like seems to be doing pretty well. So I think it's just different strategies at different ends of the spectrum. And yeah, when you have a small fund, you're playing for the carry, right? Like no one is getting rich off management fees with a smaller fund. And so, this is why it's worth it sometimes to keep fund size small and to hope you catch one of these really, really big winners.
This is a 5-year-old company, and I think I saw that the co-founders will each walk away with $3 billion, and it's like,
Wild.
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Just thinking about what I've been doing for the last 5 years.
I also saw, I think it was Katie Roof was saying that there were 11 billion plus venture-backed deal acquisitions, which is a record. And I think we might see like two different types of trends. There's like the companies that have raised like way too much money, and so the path to acquisition is tricky. I think another Wiz size deal is going to be hard to get done. But are we going to see some acquisitions rather than path to IPO? So I'm curious what kind of trends we'll see this year, because a lot of capital is going into a lot of these AI companies. But I think we've talked about it a few times. These like foundation models, are they going to be 20 different foundation models, or are they going to be like 5 or 6? And so it'd be interesting to see if we see more acquisitions this time around.
It's kind of fascinating that one of the biggest stories of this week is about a company that has an incredible data asset, but it filed for bankruptcy, and that's 23andMe. This has not been a surprise. Wojcicki has been trying to take the company private for quite some time, and I think those bids were rejected. And so apparently she is now going to step back so that she can become an independent bidder herself, which is exciting. And I'll just say, like, I'm so much more on board with this comeback story than the Adam Neumann WeWork to what's his new company, Flow. But still kind of a fascinating story of a company that should have been really well positioned potentially for the AI wave, but unfortunately is now in a state of bankruptcy.
I feel like she's like the perfect example of founder market fit. Like, I don't see another CEO or an executive being able to run the company. I think for now the CFO is stepping in as interim CEO, but I'm curious who they're even considering. Is that she's so passionate about the company. She's built it from the ground up. She's done an incredible job. I think there's some like macro trends around like D2C for these types of companies, but it's I know a lot of friends who've used it. It's a product that a lot of people love, and I'm personally rooting for Anne that she puts in a successful bid to take the company private.
I am also rooting for Anne, and yes, I hope all of this works out. But if it doesn't, I will be, curious to see if any like cybersecurity companies sort of seize the moment to say like, $6 billion of enterprise value like vanish overnight because of that data leak, right? Like last year, and then the board, they all resigned over it, and it was just really rough. So. Anyways, marketer me can't turn my brain off on some of these things.
Well, pulling it back to IPOs, I think it's also a reckoning for all the SPACs that went out in 2021 and whether or not companies were ready to be public companies, because a data breach is catastrophic, whether you're public or private, but there's ways to manage through it when you're not in the public eye. And so it's a question that I think people didn't think fully enough during the heydays of ZERP era, because 23andMe went public via a SPAC and not the traditional route.
Oh, that's 100%.
Right. So they raised like almost $1 billion, right? And they have yet to be profitable. So I think that it's still, of that era, which is funny because they've been around for a really long time.
Have I confessed that like I had a front row seat to the beginning of the SPAC apocalypse?
Oh my God, tell us everything.
No, I was at Social Capital when we took the SPAC public that kicked off the SPAC craze, IPOA. When we took that first SPAC public, the idea was there should be other mechanisms for companies to go public that are maybe more founder friendly, don't require quite as much prep. And I think we've seen the downside of maybe you should go through the ringer before you become a public company. And of course, I'd also been through that process at Box with its IPO. So anyway, sorry guys, I apologize. I apologize for the SPACs. Maybe another headline to talk through, the Brian Johnson and New York Times story. And this is one I've been waiting for weeks, because Brian, the subject of this piece, told us about it a couple weeks ago. So highest level, the New York Times interviewed former employees who accused him of doing some pretty extreme practices with NDAs to keep them from talking about him and the workplace, which is technically his home. There were even some people he had dated who were also required to sign NDAs. And maybe since not everyone is a longevity bro yet, Brian Johnson is a longevity influencer. He's the founder of Blueprint, which is a health and wellness company. He is the self-professed leader of a cult called Don't Die. You can assume what the cult's purpose is. And he essentially runs experiments with his own body to try to reverse their slow chronological age. And before we get into this article and the accusations, I'll just say, like, I actually think that's kind of cool. Like, if someone wants to donate their body to science and totally sabotage like a fun lifestyle, that's fine with me. And then interestingly, before his longevity era, he was the founder of Braintree, which is a PayPal competitor, and Kernel, which is a Neuralink competitor. So like maybe he has a thing for Elon Musk. This is a fun one to talk about from the comms perspective. I know we've been like going back and forth on the group chat about this, but it also gets us to our main topic for the day, which is, does anyone care about bad behavior in startup land anymore? Or do we all just want to be entertained?
Yeah, and I'm so curious, Helen, what you think about how Brian's handled the comm situation of all of it. I admittedly told this group that when the first article came out, I didn't read the article itself. I just saw the reactions of Twitter, and I just assumed that it was related to his relationship with his ex-girlfriend. Then I, obviously read it, and then found out the majority of it was unrelated and was more so around his handlings. And so I'm curious, Helen, what you thought about his comm strategy.
Yeah, I mean, like, not a huge Brian Johnson fan personally, but I'd give him like a 10 out of 10 on the comms.
We should have provided a disclaimer. No one here is part of the Don't Die cult on the podcast.
We all are mortals. Disclaimer.
Living forever stresses me out. So yeah, 10 out of 10 on the comms. I think a couple reasons. The first, like, Sally, exactly what you just said. Like, he knows his core audience. He's got like, I think 500,000 followers on Twitter. He's built sort of like a cult. And he knows that audience that's very online and very on Twitter, like, is not reading the New York Times. They buy into like the lamestream media rhetoric. And frankly, like, more and more, they rely on Twitter for their source of news, right? And so by publishing a video that speaks directly to them, he gets to summarize the article his way and say, like, never mind, you don't have to read it. I can summarize it for you, and I'm going to tell you the truth. And so I thought that was pretty smart, because I think if you actually read the article, that's not the point of the article at all, right? But like, just like you said, Sally, he just makes that assumption, like, that they haven't read it, and he just summarizes it for them. So the second thing that I thought was really smart was like masterful sort of deflection on the storyline and message. Like, again, because his audience most likely did not read the article, he's focusing the main part of his video on refuting, like, case by case, right? He said he has the receipts, like, to basically, I think, show a Instagram reel that his ex maybe posted a couple of weeks ago. Like, I never saw it. I doubt many people even saw it, but he basically takes up the entire video to like show that, she's not really a credible person, because he's got, all of this evidence to the contrary, and that he is actually the hero boyfriend that he wants you to believe. He doesn't really address anything about NDAs or any of the allegations of misbehavior that were like central to the New York Times article. So, I thought that was like really interesting. And smart. Like, it's like a crisis comms 301 for founders who, want to manage a negative story that's circling. So, I mean, basically he's counting on there not being any overlap between like people who read the New York Times piece and people who follow him on Twitter, because he's probably right. Like, the only freaks that like overlap are on this podcast.
In deflection. And honestly, I don't even think people are talking about this article anymore. And you think about the time, like, was it like 5, 6, 7 years ago, and things happened at Uber or at various tech companies, and we were talking about this for weeks and weeks on end. And I don't know, I think we have a attention span ADD issue, and so we've moved on to the next story. Like, I think the other one that we were talking about, Ashley, was with Facebook. There was the new book that came out, and people stopped talking about it after a week. I think there was maybe like a headline or two in the New York Post with, how much they were spending on lingerie, and then we moved on to the next one and the next one.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I will say, I think I agree, Helen, this is Crisis Comms 301, really only though for people who benefit from like attention, whether it's good or bad, right? I think like Brian Johnson has already built a brand as this like really sort of kooky, controversial guy. If you follow him on Instagram, as I do, he's, naked all the time. He's measuring his erections. He's, taking his son's blood plasma. I don't think anyone, I guess like, I don't think anyone would have been shocked reading this article. And I actually think that even if his core audience had read about the NDAs, I think that nuance would have been like lost on many people, or even they'd be like, he's so savvy, like he's protecting himself in advance. It's funny, even the New York Times buried what I thought were the most interesting points in the story when I went back and read it. One, Blueprint, his health and wellness company, is supposedly running out of money, even though it claims to be profitable. Brian is the only investor. I think he's put about 25 million of his own cash into the business. Two, they did some sort of clinical trial with people to test out Blueprint's like supplements and Brian's diet, and a number of people who participated in that study ended up with lower testosterone and were pre-diabetic, which is just like kind of amazing because, if you follow him, if you're a disciple of, Brian and his Don't Die cult, those two things are pretty contrary to the promise of his lifestyle and brand. And then the third is the funniest. And of course, I have no idea where the New York Times got these facts or if they're true, but the piece was in many ways a response to all the attention he got for a Netflix documentary about what he's building. And in that documentary, it's claimed that Brian has reversed his age by 5.1 years. And apparently the New York Times like found internal evidence from blood tests that he's actually like advanced his chronological age by 10 years, which is probably the most sort of like existential and damning claim of this entire piece, right? Like if you think this guy is magically reversing his age and it turns out he's advancing it. And so I just think it's hilarious and kind of amazing that with all of this hand waving, with all of this sort of like shoving messy relationship drama in our face, probably the most essential piece of reporting in this article,
nobody's talking about Twitter for sure.
Yeah. And then the careless people thing is so interesting because so this is a former Meta employee who was on the policy team and had a front row seat to a lot of really interesting situations that the Facebook leadership team confronted over the years. And, she makes some pretty big accusations, like, Facebook sort of ceding to China's sort of data needs for Facebook to operate in China, some more personal accusations too with various Facebook staff. And I have not seen like a single person posting about it in my Twitter feed. I haven't had any friends texting me about the book. The most of the commentary I've seen has actually been press pieces in response to the fact that Facebook has tried so hard to like discredit this author and shut her down, and they actually got some judge to rule in their favor and tell her that she's not allowed to like promote her book.
I think, it is like a New York Times bestseller at this point. And, if you're a Spotify premium user, like it's kind of, it like got pushed to me that I should read it and that it was a free audiobook, so I don't know how effective ultimately whatever they were able to get approved by the judge was. Like, I think probably backlash a little bit.
I think she's ignoring it and it's working for her. Yeah, it's just funny. I think part of it though, it's a New York Times bestseller. So like the book is doing well. People are reading it. I don't know if it's changing anyone's opinions about Facebook or Meta. And part of that is just like the bar for what shocks us now is so high. And not going back to my social capital days, but I remember in the wake of the 2016 election, Chamath had done some talk at Stanford, and it was recorded. And like maybe like a month after the talk, the recording went viral. And specifically, this point at which he said Facebook was ripping apart the fabric of society or democracy. And that was notable because he was a former Facebook exec, and that's how he really got on the map in tech. And it sent shockwaves through the ecosystem, right? Because I think we were all grappling with the 2016 election, Cambridge Analytica scandal. It was sort of like this like awakening moment in tech, or this moment of disillusionment. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of articles about this one talk. And it's just wild because the accusations in this book are so specific and so alarming, and yet like we are past the point of being able to be alarmed. And I think maybe that gets us to like my thesis is that right now people just want to be entertained. Like the bar for like bad behavior that catches people's attention is so high. And when every day you have, Elon and Doge doing crazy things, you have, many of our biggest tech execs choosing to go on Joe Rogan instead of, traditional media platforms. We've just shifted into this sort of like new era that I think is very reminiscent of what happened to political news with the rise of Trump, where political news became entertainment, and now startup and business news is becoming entertainment. And it's kind of a fascinating thing to watch, both in terms of how these leaders are choosing to behave and what the new media platforms are that support this.
Yeah, and I think also just a reminder of like, given the like fact that like Careless People is a New York Times bestseller, and you forget that sometimes, Twitter is a very niche audience and an echo chamber, and the rest of the country might be thinking something different. Like when I used to be at CNBC, I would have my team watch an hour or two of Fox News every week, because at the time it was 80% of America was watching Fox News. Fox News is probably moderate at this point based on like some of the other content out there. But you just like to understand a bigger audience of like where the rest of the country is thinking. And I think that's another reminder of like, the reaction of Brian Johnson, that is the reaction of Silicon Valley and tech. I think that's a lot of the discourse around it, but I'm curious what the rest of the country is thinking, or like how well the New York Times piece actually has done. Because I didn't know, Helen, until you brought it up, that Careless People was a New York Times bestseller. So it seems like there's
I wish I had this graphic in front of me, but there was like a favorability rating for all the top like tech execs or top billionaires maybe. And like Elon is actually incredibly polarizing, right? And it falls unsurprisingly along political lines. I think Warren Buffett was the billionaire that people had overall the most like positive or neutral response to. Jeff Bezos, very binary. And so, so maybe there's this like cult of adoration on certain platforms, but then more broadly, the sort of reputations of these, these like titans of industry are pretty complex. And I do think about this a lot in terms of like, what is the reputation of tech beyond like our sort of insular like tech community, because that, it's going to matter in the long run. And maybe we have a favorable administration right now, but what's the next administration, and how do people see, the sort of biggest voices and most powerful people in tech, and what
I agree that this feels like a two-step forward, like in the short term, because there are so many, influential tech voices right now around the Trump administration, in and around it. But overall, tracking like, general sentiment about tech and Silicon Valley and venture capital in general, like this is going to be like a 3 steps back thing. And we won't realize that until, a couple of years after this administration is over. But like, Ashley, going back to your, do people even care anymore? I think people care. I think people pay attention on an individual level. Like I definitely noticed, way before 2016, when, I feel like it was a little bit more, the environment was right to kind of call out bad behavior. And I think that people would call that cancel culture. I think people pay attention, right? It's just that they have nothing to do. Like they have nowhere to channel that in like a movement. And I think that a lot of the voices that were, the most vocally against things like DEI, like there's a good overlap between those folks and, speaking out against cancel culture. And like, here's the thing, like, I don't think anybody is like a fan of cancel culture. Like nobody's like, we should bring back cancel culture. Cancel culture's net positive for society. But like, I also don't think everybody is pro like holding people accountable for their actions. So I don't really know how to reconcile those things, but I would push a little bit on like the people don't care. Like I think people do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who cares to talk about it?
I was being a little intentionally
Yeah.
dramatic. I mean, I care, I pay attention, and I do think the tech industry, and I imagine all industries, like you got to play the long game. Reputations, integrity are going to be the best path for most people. I mean, we see some of the biggest actors playing maybe a riskier game, but yeah, I believe that like your ability to hire great people can be impacted by what you say online. And who knows, like Brian Johnson might have a really hard time finding people who want to come work for him after this New York Times piece. It's just you don't get to see that feedback loop right away. You just see like who won the Twitter war.
Well, he did comment that after the New York Times piece that he saw an uptick in applications to open roles on his team. But
yeah, the world is just getting more and more tribal.
Need to trust but verify that comment.
Yeah.
But yeah, Helen, you said something really interesting the other day, which is like, imagine what this moment must feel like if you started your career sort of in that like 2016 to 2022 period, which like was a moment when maybe people in tech and beyond were like grappling with like power imbalances and bad behavior. And of course, we all started our careers, not to date us, before that. And so it's interesting because I think with like, the benefit of a longer time horizon, unfortunately, it really feels like that period where maybe like the powerful in the industry were like self-policing a little bit was the aberration. And actually we're sort of just back on the trend line that already existed. It's just the bad behavior wasn't as out in the open now. And now it's being celebrated. It's entertainment. People are leveraging that to get more attention and to build their brands, with Brian being an incredible example of that. So yeah, if you started your tech career in say like 2018 or 2020, this must feel like such a crazy right turn. But really
it's kind of like starting your VC career in 2021, 2022. Not like anybody on the pod
things
did that.
only go up. Yeah, totally.
I was listening to an interview with Howard Lutnick, who is the, I think, Secretary of Treasury. Is that right? Treasury of Commerce. I'm going to have to fact check myself on that. But he was saying he helped run the transition team for President Trump. And when they were screening for cabinet members, they had the qualifications on one side and they had a video clip of them speaking for 30 seconds, because as part of that vetting, they wanted to understand how well they did as communicators, ambassadors of the story, because they understand that everything is so narrative driven right now. So it's not just about your qualifications, it's about how well you can tell the story and break through, Ashley, to your point, all of the noise that exists and keep that consistent messaging. And I just thought it was really stark to hear him say so plainly that this was like the number one thing they were screening for when they were looking for cabinet members, which is frankly really smart in this environment when there's so many tweets and so many headlines. Like, you need people that can keep the coherent narrative, that can rise up above all of the noise that's happening.
I have a bias for founders and CEOs who are great storytellers. And I think it's always been an advantage to be able to tell like a powerful story that, like goes beyond the feature set or the problem solution of your company. And I think now there's this sort of extra opportunity for folks who know how to navigate it to like lean into the entertainment aspect of the industry a little bit more. I mean, I think as soon as we saw Netflix series about WeWork, and like there's just like more mainstream appetite for technology news and drama, and I think you've got to be careful not to overcorrect.
Like Pete Hegseth, who
Who's
But
starting a new podcast?
there's also an element of like understanding the moment you're in and being able to adapt to it without losing sight of, your long-term ambitions and who your core audience is and how you want them to feel. And I think that's actually the most dangerous part of this moment is if you're playing to a very small and specific crowd, so maybe the chronically online tech crowd, and that is not your core audience, and that is not the audience that is like existential for your business, I think you can lose your way. And so that's where just being like eyes wide open about who matters, who you need to reach, how you want them to feel, but then having creativity with how you do that.
Yeah. I think that's a good segue into our last rapid fire. Angela, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so this Q&A is brought to you by Mercury, the fintech that is used by over 200,000 startups to simplify their finances. The first question we have, I've been working as a startup operator for several years, and now I'm ready to pivot into VC. Ultimately, I want to become an investor and have recently joined an angel investing community. However, others have suggested I first get a job in platform VC as it's a great fit with my background. But others have said it's hard to pivot from platform into an investor role, and platform roles are getting hard to find as firms are cutting these types of roles. What are your thoughts? That was a long question, but hopefully you guys got it.
That's a good one. So I'll take a first pass. So I remember a former colleague who was an executive and someone I looked up to. She was CMO of a top tier firm for a while, and when I was venture curious, I asked her because that seems like a natural path for me to just kind of follow in her footsteps. And I remember if I asked her how it was, and she made maybe like a little bit of a flippant comment where she's like, yeah, this role is great if you want to make a lot of money, fly first class everywhere, but then also get treated like a secretary by 24-year-old associates. And maybe that trade-off works for some people. Like she is still at that job and it's been almost 10 years, right? But I will say like, it's pretty hard to make the transition from like that role into an investing role. Where I see this work well is like where you have the hybrid role from the beginning. Like I think there is someone at XYZ and there is someone at Coatue who has, had that like general partner plus CMO role like from the beginning. And so that would be like the angle that I go to.
Yeah, like I had a similar experience. When I first left CNBC, I considered going into venture. So I started to talk to a few funds. And of course, naturally, people, asked if I wanted to be an operating partner just because of my media experience. And I did a little bit of a research, and I think more people told me that it would be harder for me to go from an operating partner to a partner in an investing role than to go join a startup, leave, or start a company, get some operating and hands-on experience for a few years, and then come back. So it was either I go to the track of, do I get into venture directly, or do I go into an operating role and stay in that role, which, by the way, I heard gets paid very well, to your point, Helen. But to think that just to go into a fund to be able to navigate is almost near impossible was,
I mean, I feel like we're really speaking to there being a hierarchy, right?
No.
Yeah, I know. Hush, hush. Everything's a democracy.
There's definitely a hierarchy. I feel like my career was designed in a lab to like answer this question because, like the person asking, I like started my career as an operator. I went to Social Capital as the first like marketing partner. I also had talent under my remit, so I was very much on the platform team. I will say I did not join thinking that was a path onto the investing team. Like I was venture curious, but I more wanted the ecosystem view than a career change to investing. And I remember people asking me like, oh, are you going to like, is this your way to like try to get into investing? At the time I was like, oh man, I would hate that. Like the feedback loops are so long. I like to know what I'm doing is working. I will say Social Capital was unique because it placed such an emphasis on platform. We had all these brilliant data scientists and growth people. And so didn't feel like a second class citizen, which I think can very much be the situation in a lot of VC firms where they don't know how to value careers outside of like the core investing activity. After I left Social Capital, I did get a couple hybrid offers, and I've seen those work for some people. I mean, Josh Constine, he went from TechCrunch to Signal Fire as an example. I think he had like a split content and an investing role. My assumption though is it is easier to build a brand as an operator than as an investor, because again, the feedback loops as an investor are so long. And so I would lean into build a killer brand as an operator, because that's going to be your edge, and that's where you can actually like build a real reputation and sort of like a clear founder value add. Definitely angel invest if you can, which it sounds like this person can. And then I would only take a platform role if you just want to get a sense for, is venture something I would like to do? Because like that's, you know, it's one of those jobs that like looks very different from the outside than it feels on the inside. And so that exposure is helpful, but I think it's probably a tough path from operating partner to an investor, unless to Helen and Sally's point, like you articulate that from the beginning.
Or you take Angela's route and go from Goldman Investment Banking to TPG to SoftBank.
Very unrelated to operating.
Yeah, that listener's like freaking out right now. She's like, I have to go work at Goldman Sachs. Yeah. So.
Yeah, we'll see you in 10 years when you emerge.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great way to end. So we'll see you guys all next week on next episode of Great Chat.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to A Great Chat. Make sure to submit your questions on anothergreatchat.com. See you next week.